Our speakers today are Andy and Dee Hall, who co-founded the nonpartisan, nonprofit Wisconsin Center for Investigative Journalism in 2009. Andy and Dee met in the late 1970s working on the campus newspaper at Indiana University in Bloomington. They previously worked for 8 years as reporters for the Arizona Republic in Phoenix in the 80s and moved to Madison in 1990 to begin reporting jobs at the Wisconsin State Journal. Andy and Dee will explore the forces imperiling local news in Wisconsin and nationwide, why this threatens our democracy, and what journalists and the public can do about it. We look forward to their presentation, and we have made a contribution to the Rotary's Polio Plus Fund as a way of saying thanks for speaking to us today. If time allows, I will be asking Andy and Dee questions that have been submitted in advance by our members. And Andy and Dee did say that they have time after our meeting, if you have further questions, to come up and see them at the podium. So, Andy and Dee, welcome.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon. And thank you to the Madison Downtown Rotary for this opportunity to share our story with all of you today. Dee and I launched our investigative news center in our basement more than 10 years ago.
I was told I'll have to move it for me.
Okay, can everybody hear me okay? All right, great. So Dee and I launched our investigative news center in our basement more than 10 years ago as the financial underpinnings of journalism had already started to crumble. A pretty smart business move to launch in a struggling industry during the Great Recession, huh? But the story we want to share with you today is not one of despair or disaster. It is one of hope. Wisconsin Watch, the news outlet of the Wisconsin Center for Investigative Journalism, has become a national leader in a rapidly growing movement of nonpartisan, nonprofit news outlets that help sustain local journalism and strengthen democracy. Support from foundations and individuals who value journalism allows us to give our stories away for free to editors across Wisconsin and around the country. So let's start by talking about the economics of journalism. You can still have the news delivered to your doorstep in many communities, but financial and social forces threaten the legacy model of news and therefore our democracy. As you may know, the arrival of the internet led to the collapse of the traditional newspaper model. Quite simply, most advertisers no longer need newspapers to reach their customers. In fact, from 2006 to 2018, newspaper advertising revenue plummeted nationwide by 71%. That's the area you can see circled there, the sharp downward trajectory. As a result, many newspaper editors, reporters, and photographers have lost their jobs. Across the country, the number of newsroom employees dropped by almost half in just 10 years. And the growth in digital news is not nearly enough to make up for these losses. So this means that many communities are losing their local newspapers. This map shows news deserts across the United States. The blue counties have more than one newspaper, but the yellow counties have just one newspaper, and it's usually a weekly. 171 counties, seen in red, have no newspapers at all. What this map doesn't show is that news deserts aren't just geographic boundaries. A news desert can isolate economic, racial, ethnic, and cultural groups from reliable sources of information too. A community that has lost its newspaper has lost a vital way to stay informed and to hold the government and institutions accountable. This is a problem across the country and here at home. Wisconsin has lost 77 newspapers, mostly weeklies, in just the past 15 years. And the state's newspaper circulation dropped by 1 million since 2004, leaving the current circulation of about 1.5 million. What happens when newspapers die? Here's what researchers have found across the country. There's lower voter turnout, fewer competitive races for office. Voters don't even know who's running for Congress. Government waste increases when reporters and the public aren't watching. Businesses feel free to pollute, and regulators feel free to look the other way. And so, when fact-based news disappears, residents start to get information from biased sources instead of reliable, nonpartisan ones, which hardens their political positions. The bottom line, no news is bad news for our democracy. So, I promised we'd give you some hope today. What is the good news here? Well, here's a bit of it. In-depth stories that dive behind the daily headlines can do a lot of good. Economist James Hamilton has actually tallied the value of investigative journalism. He found that each dollar spent on an investigative story can generate hundreds of dollars in benefits to society. Stories costing thousands of dollars can in fact generate millions in benefits to a community. The problem is that investigative reporting is the most expensive type of journalism. It sometimes takes weeks, even months of work, with no guaranteed outcome. After all, it is an investigation. Many news organizations, especially smaller ones, cannot afford investigative reporting. So here's the reality. The number of newspapers is down. The number of reporters covering news is down. Hard-hitting news is too expensive, and the public's trust in news is declining. Gallup sums up the trust issue this way. Americans' trust in the media has been eroding over time, but in the current highly polarized climate, the views of political partisans have become increasingly divergent. President Donald Trump's description of the media as the enemy of the people has undoubtedly colored the views of all Americans, says Gallup. Media that report only one side of the story further erode that trust. Millions of Americans get their news exclusively from Fox News on the right or MSNBC on the left. This split makes viewers unaware of, and often hostile to, perspectives different from the ones that they see on TV. And what they see is often not reporting, but merely commentary. That can lead to confusion over what's fact and what's opinion. Additionally, 2/3 of Americans now get at least some of their news on social media, a mishmash of legitimate news and propaganda and garbage. According to the Knight Foundation, fake and conspiracy news publishers put out millions of tweets before the 2016 election, and that pattern continues today. Because the internet and social media are major sources of disinformation, that leads to further distrust of legitimate journalism. Consider the explosive quote-unquote stories like the child sex ring run by Hillary Clinton at a Washington, D.C. pizza restaurant. When these stories are hyped by fake news publishers and contradicted or ignored by mainstream news outlets, consumers of fake news come to distrust actual factual news.
But there's hope. Nonprofit news organizations like Wisconsin Watch. We are located here in Madison at the UW School of Journalism and Mass Communication. We were among the very first state-based investigative news outlets when we started in 2009, and we remain a leader in the field. As we watched the steady decline of newspapers, Andy and I felt it was important to create a news organization to produce investigative stories to make life better for the people here in Wisconsin. Over the dinner table, we came up with our mission. We have tweaked it slightly in the past 10 years. Our mission, to increase the quality, quantity, and understanding of investigative journalism, to foster an informed citizenry and strengthen democracy. We came up with 3 guiding values to help us choose what to investigate. They are protect the vulnerable, expose wrongdoing, explore solutions. We use these values as a checklist to decide what stories to cover. We look for broken and failing systems, and we put those findings and potential solutions into a state, regional, and national context. We also train the next generation of investigative journalists. Under a contract with UW, we hire paid student interns, and we serve as a resource for journalism students and faculty in exchange for use of the office space. The interns pictured here have all gone on to careers in journalism. Emily Hamer, up top with the camera, is a reporter for the Wisconsin State Journal. You've probably seen her byline a lot. Alex Arriaga, below with the microphone, works for PRISM, a nonprofit news organization. And in the graduation gowns, we have Louisa Lincoln on the left. She works for the Public Radio Exchange. To her right is Haley Sperling, who works for WisContext. And on the right is Mia Sato, who is down in Chicago working for the Better Government Association, which investigates corruption and waste in government. We now have 48 former interns and fellows. We are enormously proud of the work they're doing in Wisconsin, across the nation, and around the globe. They work at the Wall Street Journal, the USA Today investigative team, the Telegraph's Moscow Bureau, BBC's investigative desk, and as journalists from Appleton to Africa. Other former interns work on the business side of journalism, raising money and engaging the public for nonprofit newsrooms. I mentioned that one of our guiding values is protecting the vulnerable. Who is more vulnerable than a person who is trafficked, held hostage by the threat that his family's home in Mexico would be stolen by traffickers if he refused to work? That's what happened to Roberto, featured in one of our recent stories. Roberto came to the U.S. legally, but traffickers took him and a group of other Mexican workers illegally to work in a cabbage field in Wisconsin. They suffered in the heat and cold with little medical attention. They were given fake names. They were ordered not to talk to strangers or to venture outside the motel where they were living, 4 men to a room. Before they were charged with trafficking, the labor contractors had stolen thousands of dollars in wages from them. Another vulnerable group we covered is inmates in long-term solitary confinement. They are isolated not only from other inmates, but also the public. Because the state would not let us interview them, we sent them mailed surveys to find out what conditions were like. They reported despair, suicide attempts, and mental health problems. Some lost the ability to interact normally with other people. LaRon McKinley Bay, seen here, spent 27 years in a cell the size of a parking space. We investigated hate in Wisconsin. We found a growing number of incidents, including swastikas painted on the side of temples, a man who ordered his doctor out of the examining room when he found out she was Muslim, a sacred fire circle on the UW-Madison campus defaced on Indigenous Peoples Day with graffiti that read, "Columbus Rules, 1492. And we raised hard questions about how college sports handles concussions and repeated blows to the head. In 2017, when a Wisconsin Watch reporter first spoke with Badgers football player Austin Ramish, he brushed off concerns about head injuries. A year later, he had left the game because of them. Ramish was on the cusp of a contract with the NFL's Arizona Cardinals, but he walked away from training camp because he was alarmed by changes in his mental state, including overwhelming anxiety. He told us, quote, "I was worried that it was going to get worse if I continued to go on. I don't want it to get to the point where I just can't really function at all." Our stories have impact, and sometimes it's huge. In 2013, we found Wisconsin was declining to take $14 million in federal funding to help people with disabilities get work. After our story ran, Governor Scott Walker reversed the policy, and a waiting list of 3,000 people with disabilities was erased. In 2018, we published a series of stories highlighting vulnerabilities in Wisconsin's voting systems. The Wisconsin Elections Commission then took action to correct security gaps in those systems. For our Failure at the Faucet series, we wrote about Judy Tremmel and her daughter Samantha. About 15 years ago, when she was a baby, Samantha nearly died after Judy bathed her in manure-tainted drinking water at their home in Kewaunee County. That series found that nearly 1 out of every 5 private wells tested across the state was positive for coliform bacteria. That's an indicator of viruses or other pathogens that can make you sick. 2 years after our national award-winning series, Governor Tony Evers declared 2019 the year of clean drinking water. He used statistics from our own stories in making that declaration. To keep doing this important work, we get funding from a variety of sources, some of them in the room with us here today. Thanks so much for your support. Wisconsin Watch gets money from local and national foundations, and 37% of our revenue comes from individual donors, including members of our Watchdog Club. They give at least $1,000 a year. Membership includes intimate chats with well-known journalists and other perks. Individual donations are now our fastest growing source of revenue in our $800,000 a year budget. This revenue allows us to distribute all of our stories for free to the media of Wisconsin and beyond. Thanks to a partnership with the Institute for Nonprofit News and the Associated Press, millions of people across the country and Canada now see Wisconsin Watch stories. In the past year, 335 news outlets carried our stories. We reached more than 20 million people in 36 states, D.C., and Canada. Wisconsin Watch acts as a hub for news in Wisconsin. Although our staff is small, just 6 professional staff members, we collaborate with numerous media outlets to produce an impressive body of in-depth projects, about 30 a year. We have an especially close partnership with Wisconsin Public Radio, which pays for a fellow who is embedded in our newsroom.
And we are a leader in nonprofit news nationwide. The same year that Wisconsin Watch was founded, I joined with about 24 other journalists to form an umbrella organization that could help nonprofit newsrooms nationwide. That organization, which Dee mentioned just a moment ago, is the Institute for Nonprofit News. It started with just 27 members. It now has 240. All are required to meet high standards for financial transparency, accuracy, and independence. Standards, by the way, that we have taken a lead role in creating and upholding to help ensure that you can trust members' news coverage. And because of our commitment to transparency, last year we were invited to join the Trust Project, a global network of news organizations that pledge to help people assess the credibility of the stories they read. Trust Project members commit to ethical practices, inclusive reporting, fact-checking, and correcting errors. We also explain how and why we do stories. For example, in September, Dee wrote a column explaining why we waited 18 months to tell the story of Roberto and the steps we took to protect him from harm. How else do we earn trust? One way is through rigorous fact-checking of our stories. We check every number. We check the spelling of each name. We verify a person's title and affiliations. We use transcripts of taped interviews to make sure quotes are accurate, word for word. And we make sure those quotes are used in the right context. A typical report takes 8 to 12 hours to fact check. An upcoming story on sexual abuse in the Catholic Church in Wisconsin took more than 20 hours, and that's 2 people working together. Even veteran reporters, like former Wisconsin Watch staff member Bill Leaders, go through fact-checking. Here he stands next to 4 years' worth of fact-checking files. But yet, even after completing all of that fact-checking, everyone's still smiling. So, let's get to you. How do you know whether the news that you read, see, and hear is trustworthy? Here are some things to look for. Are the sources named? If not, why not? The news organization should explain that. Are a range of viewpoints represented? Are key facts in the report confirmed by other news media, especially trusted ones? Does the news organization, if it's a nonprofit, reveal how it gets its money so that you can assess whether its stories are truly independent of its funders? Does it promptly correct information that is wrong? Does it cover news from a nonpartisan viewpoint? or is it always from a conservative or liberal point of view? Some final thoughts on ways to become a better news consumer. Refrain from spreading misinformation on social media. You know the posts and the tweets that I'm talking about. Yep, the ones from that relative. Don't do it. Avoid living in a news bubble. Read, listen to, and watch news from diverse sources. Get involved in issues that matter to you. Support news organizations, whether they're for-profit or nonprofit, that you trust. And that includes, of course, our friends from Simpson Street Free Press who are here today. Attend their events. Donate. Subscribe. And by the way, on the way out, feel free to pick up, we have information on the back table. You can sign up for our free newsletters. We have informational info back there as well about what we're about. And feel free to chat with our staff who are here today, Barbara Johnson, Emily Neinfeld, and Lauren Furman, as well as Dee and I. I'd be happy to stand around and talk afterwards. Tell others about the news and the news organizations that you trust. And tell your local news outlet how it is doing so that it can improve. In closing, thanks so much for giving us a chance to discuss these troubling trends in the news landscape and some of the hopeful signs that we see moving forward for journalism and for our democracy. We ask that you do what you can. Help to carry the torch of truth, carry it forward into the fog and the darkness. The stakes couldn't possibly be higher for us, for our children, and for the next generations. Thank you.
So Andy and Dee, we had one question submitted, but it does have two parts. The question is, what is your response to the accusation that the press is reporting fake news, and has the role of the free press been damaged because of this?
Yeah, go ahead.
So yeah, that reminds me of the legal arguments that people make when they don't want to actually address the facts. They will just attack the news outlet and say, well, that's fake news. It's sort of a nice coverall for everything that you don't like, everything that you would like to turn people's faces away from. So I would say that it's a mantra that is used by people who want to control and to undermine the press, which we didn't exactly mention it, but it is one of the most important institutions. It's one of the checks and balances that we have on our government and society. And the second part was?
Has the role of the free press been damaged because of this?
Yes. Yes, it has. No, I believe so, because I believe that there are a certain number of people who believe that mantra, that we are the enemy of the people, that we are trafficking in misinformation, that we are the purveyors of propaganda, but we are the opposite of that.
And that, by the way, is exactly why in 2017 we did make a slight change in our organization's mission statement. It now says it is to increase the quality, quantity, and understanding of investigative journalism in Wisconsin to inform the citizenry and strengthen democracy. We added "and understanding," recognizing that all the great work of our staff and other staffs will be wasted if people don't understand what investigative journalists do, how we do it, why it matters, and that's one reason why conversations like this one here today are absolutely critical, not just to our organization, but actually to the fabric of our society and to democracy.
Thanks again for your presentation. Dee and Andy will be up here afterwards. If you have further questions, we are adjourned.